The headlights of Clara's old pickup truck cut through the darkness as she turned off the main road onto a gravel path she'd never traveled before. The job listing had been simple enough. Night caretaker needed for livestock operation, experience preferred but not required, room and board included. She'd answered it out of desperation, having lost her apartment in town when the diner where she'd worked for 3 years suddenly closed its doors. The ranch appeared gradually, first as scattered lights in the distance, then as the outline of a large farmhouse surrounded by barns and fenced pastures. She parked near the main house and stepped out into the cool October air, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The sky above was impossibly vast, scattered with more stars than she'd ever seen from her place in town. A figure emerged from the barn, walking toward her with the easy gait of someone who knew this land intimately. As he drew closer, the porch light illuminated his features, a man perhaps in his late 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes that seemed to carry both warmth and something heavier, like grief that had settled into the bones. "You must be Clara," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Daniel Mercer. Welcome to Blackwater Ranch." His handshake was firm but gentle, his palm calloused from years of physical work. Clara noticed the wedding ring on his left hand, a simple gold band that caught the light. "Thank you for giving me a chance," she said. "I know I don't have much experience with ranching." Daniel smiled, and it transformed his face, softening the worry lines around his eyes. "Horses and cattle aren't complicated. They want food, water, and someone who pays attention. The night shift is mostly about watching for problems, checking on the pregnant mares, making sure nothing goes wrong while the world sleeps." He showed her around the property that first night, explaining the routines and rhythms of the operation. Blackwater Ranch had been in his family for 4 generations, he told her. 200 acres of rolling pasture land, a herd of Black Angus cattle, and a breeding program for quarter horses that had earned recognition throughout the state. "My wife passed 2 years ago," Daniel said quietly as they stood outside the foaling barn. "Cancer. Since then, I've been trying to keep this place running, but I can't do the nights anymore. I have a daughter, Emma. She's 7. She needs me there when she wakes up from bad dreams." Clara understood then why he'd hired someone with limited experience. He needed reliability more than expertise, someone who would show up and stay through the long hours between midnight and dawn. Her quarters were a small apartment above the equipment barn, clean and simply furnished. From her window, she could see the main house where Daniel and his daughter slept. She started her shifts at 11 each night, walking the property with a flashlight, checking water troughs, listening for sounds of distress from the animals. The first weeks were quiet, almost meditative. Clara discovered she loved the solitude of the nights, the way the world seemed to hold its breath in those dark hours. She learned to read the sounds of the ranch, to distinguish between the normal settling noises and the signals that something needed attention. She and Daniel crossed paths during the transition hours, when her shift ended and his day began. They developed a routine of sharing coffee on the porch as the sky lightened, exchanging information about the night and the day ahead. Their conversations started practical but gradually became personal. Daniel told her about his wife Sarah, how they'd met at a county fair when they were teenagers, how she'd loved this land as much as he did. Clara shared her own story, the string of dead-end jobs and failed relationships that had led her here, the feeling of always searching for something she couldn't name. "Maybe you were searching for a place to belong," Daniel suggested one morning, his voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. Clara looked out at the pastures, at the horses grazing in the first light of day, and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been here 2 months, and somehow this place had begun to feel like home. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that blanketed the ranch in white silence. Clara's nights became more demanding as the cold required extra vigilance. She checked the barn heaters, made sure the cattle had access to unfrozen water, and spent long hours with the pregnant mares who were due to foal in the coming months. One night in January, a mare named Starlight went into labor 3 weeks early. Clara called Daniel immediately, and he arrived in the barn within minutes, his coat thrown hastily over his pajamas. They worked together through the night, helping the mare deliver a small but healthy filly that they warmed with blankets and watched take her first trembling steps. "You saved her," Daniel said, looking at Clara with something new in his eyes. "If you hadn't been watching, if you hadn't caught the early signs..." Clara shook her head. "We saved her." Together, they sat in the hay, as dawn broke, exhausted and exhilarated, watching the newborn filly nurse for the first time. Daniel's hand found Clara's, and she didn't pull away. His touch was warm despite the cold barn, and when their eyes met, neither of them looked away. "I haven't felt this way since Sarah," Daniel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I ever would again." Clara squeezed his hand. "I've never felt this way at all. I didn't know it was possible." They moved slowly after that night, both of them cautious with something that felt precious and fragile. Daniel introduced Clara to his daughter, Emma, who had apparently been watching the new night caretaker from her bedroom window and had already decided she liked her. "She stays up late reading," Daniel explained with a rueful smile. "She's seen you walking the pastures. She calls you the night lady." Emma was a serious child with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, which Clara saw in the photographs throughout the house. She asked Clara questions about the animals, about the stars, about why the nights were so long in winter and so short in summer. Clara answered as best she could, finding in herself a patience she hadn't known she possessed. Spring arrived with mud and new life, the ranch transforming into a flurry of activity as calves were born and the horses turned out to pasture. Clara's role had evolved beyond the night caretaker she'd been hired as. She helped with the day operations when needed, joined Daniel and Emma for dinners that stretched into evenings of conversation and laughter, and began to imagine a future she'd never dared to dream before. One night in April, Daniel joined her on her rounds, something he rarely did anymore. They walked together through the warm darkness, checking on the animals and talking quietly about everything and nothing. "I want to ask you something," he said as they stood by the pond, at the far edge of the property, where the reflection of the moon shimmered on the water. "But I'm afraid..." Clara turned to face him. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'll say no. Afraid you'll say yes, and then realize you want something different. Afraid of losing what we have by asking for more." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Ask me. Stay," he said, "not as an employee, not as someone passing through. Stay as someone who belongs here, with Emma and me. Stay as someone I love." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara thought about her old life, the apartments that never felt like home, the jobs that never felt like purpose, the relationships that never felt like this. She thought about the nights on this ranch, the way the darkness had wrapped around her like a blanket rather than a barrier, the way the solitude had filled her rather than emptied her. "I love you too," she said. "I think I started loving you that first night, when you told me about Sarah, when you showed me that love like yours existed in the world." Daniel kissed her then, under the stars that had become so familiar to her, surrounded by the sounds of the ranch that had become her home. It was a kiss that tasted of promise, of future, of all the nights they would share together. Summer arrived with long days and short nights, and Clara's midnight shifts became shared watches with Daniel, who often couldn't sleep and would join her on the porch to watch the stars wheel overhead. They married in September, in a small ceremony in the pasture where they'd first walked together, with Emma as the flower girl and the horses as their witnesses. Clara never went back to her old life, never wanted to. She'd come to the ranch looking for a job and found instead a home, a family, a love that had grown in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Some nights, when the world was still and the stars were bright, she would stand on the porch and remember the woman she'd been when she first drove down that gravel road, uncertain and searching. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was Clara Mercer, wife and mother and caretaker of this land, and she belonged to the night and to the man who had taught her that darkness was nothing to fear when you had someone to share it with. The years passed, marked by seasons and cycles, by births and deaths, by the eternal rhythms of the ranch. Emma grew into a young woman who loved the land as fiercely as her parents did. More children came, filling the farmhouse with noise and laughter. The nights remained Clara's favorite time, when the world quieted and she could walk the pastures with Daniel beside her, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in the same steady rhythm. She had taken a midnight job at his ranch, expecting nothing more than a paycheck and a place to sleep. Instead, the nights had pulled them closer than she ever expected, weaving their lives together until she could no longer imagine existing apart from him. Apart from this place, apart from the stars that had witnessed their love story from the very beginning.